Beauty can be light, loving and protective, yet beauty can also be dark, scary and malicious. So enjoy this week's case analysis with me, Dr. Fiona Gherkin. I specialise in dark personalities of women and the tactics they use to get what they want. In this episode, we're going to talk about Sherri Papini. Now, if you haven't heard of Sherri before, she's the real-life Gone Girl. That's a name that's often been applied to her. She was someone that vanished and turned up 22 days later in California, USA, and it turned out that she'd actually faked her own kidnapping, but it took the police 4 years to figure this out. I'm Dr. Fiona Gherkin and welcome to today's episode where we're going to talk all about the real-life Gone Girl, Sherri Papini. As per usual, I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of the case, but I'm not going to go into great detail. There are a lot of documentaries out there and videos out there that you can watch around this case. It's really about me just giving you the overview as I normally do. We're going to talk about some of those deceptive behaviours that she used, how she impacted people, but also how she fits with the dark tetrad traits. So on the 2nd of November in 2016, Sherri Papini had gone for a jog and her husband came home to find she hadn't picked up the children and her phone was found at the front of the property. 22 days later, she turned up after people had spent a significant amount of time searching for her, making cries for support. Her husband was obviously accused of doing something to her because it's always the husband. They always say it's the husband, even though Sherri for many years had been someone who had lied a lot and manipulated a lot. When she turned up after 22 days, she said that she had been kidnapped by 2 masked Hispanic women. And during that time, she was abducted. She was also tortured, chained, and branded by these women, which the authorities thought was a little bit strange because it is very unlikely for 2 women to kidnap another woman. Often it might be a man and a woman or men on their own. But there were some really weird behaviours that she displayed after she returned. And if you watch some of the police interviews that are available on YouTube, it's quite fascinating to watch her behaviour because it is all over the place. And she does a great job at trying to play the victim, but the real person does come through regularly. So it took a long time for them to figure out where she'd actually been. And when they did, they discovered that James was an ex-boyfriend of Sherri who she'd been messaging and who she'd convinced that her marriage was on the rocks and she needed to escape. There's a recent documentary that she did where she's now changed her story to say that she lied about him taking her because she didn't want to get him in trouble and that he did actually take her, torture her, chain her up and brand her without her permission. In 2022, she was charged with making false statements to a federal agent and also mail fraud because she did claim, I believe, victims of crime money, so she committed fraud as a result of her kidnapping. She ended up serving 10 months of her 18-month sentence and she was released in August of 2023. So now let's look at Sherri's behaviour and how it might fit with some of those dark tetrad traits. But let's talk about the behaviour in the first instance. So what she did was deceptive and premeditated. She had planned a kidnapping hoax and she'd self-inflicted injuries to make it look like she had been hurt, locking herself away in a closet at her ex-boyfriend's house. I have watched the recent documentary where she claims to have only done that to get a lighter sentence and to really want it to all be over, that she didn't want to be honest because it would have been seen as her cheating and therefore she would lose access to her children because her husband had actually put together a prenup agreement that said if she cheated, she would lose everything, including her children. In the recent documentary that she was in, and I'll put the name and link of that in the description. It was really interesting that she talked about how he'd done that as though he was a horrible person. However, the reason he put that prenup in place was because she had cheated before. She had been unfaithful before and he didn't really trust her. So it's not surprising that they signed a prenuptial agreement. And clearly he was right because she did end up interacting with her ex-boyfriend who she ended up staying with. Another behaviour that appeared to be something that she displayed quite often throughout her life was that she was very attention-seeking and manipulative, and that was something a range of sources had talked about. In terms of this event in particular, she certainly orchestrated this whole circus that created media spectacle, public sympathy. Apparently there were donations made to a GoFundMe which resulted in $49,000 worth of funds for the family. She applied for victims' compensation, which was another $30,000. And she also had disability benefits as a result of her experience in not being able to work. The suggestions that her saying that 2 Hispanic women had kidnapped her was actually racial profiling, and that she specifically chose those communities because they were marginalised. In the recent documentary, she actually describes how one of the women that she had them sketch was actually her ex-boyfriend's mother, and she was trying to give hints as to who had taken her. The person doing the documentary did actually ask her and say, well, actually, James's mum isn't Hispanic, so we're not quite sure where you got that from. But the documentary was very much about putting her in a positive light, so they didn't drill too much deeper. The other key thing that will fit in with the dark tetrad traits, which we'll talk about in a minute, is the chronic dishonesty. She had been dishonest on a number of occasions, not just during this time, but there's signs of her showing attention-seeking behaviour, not taking responsibility for the things she's done. So there is chronic dishonesty, lying and manipulation. And if you see a photo of Sherri, she is a very beautiful woman. She is absolutely beautiful, and she's small, and so she can come across very much as a victim. And when she was talking to the police, and you see in the interviews that she did at her home, she's all curled up in like the fetal position. It's almost as though she wants to portray herself as a victim, but unfortunately what she's saying just does not seem very believable. Although I did start to change my view after watching the documentary and listening to what she had to say. But I've certainly watched more videos around body language and deception, and I have come to the conclusion that a lot of what she said in that documentary was actually not true. So let's talk about the impact on the victims and the community. So I think the key victims in this case are certainly her husband Keith and her children. I mean, that must be really rough for them to find out that this deception occurred and that their mother had lied, but also spent time away from them. So imagine there's that sense of rejection by the children as a result of what their mother did. But it's not just the behaviour of her mother. You know, these kind of cases that are well publicised, I imagine the kids at school knew all about what their mother had done, and therefore this creates a level of bullying that often comes from other children. And I've been a part of other families where this has happened, where there's been an issue with someone disappearing or taking their own life. And what happens is everybody knows about it, especially in small communities. And it's really hard for kids because not all kids are nice and not all kids are supportive. So imagine it was probably pretty tough on them. The other impact is on those supporters and volunteers and people who donated to the GoFundMe were really misled financially, and they were exploited as a result of what she had said. For many years, people believed her, and I'm sure many people still believe that this was not a deliberate act by her. Because like I said, if you look at her and you see her speak, she seems awfully innocent and vulnerable. And she comes across that way. When you're thinking about the hoax that she created and the cost on the community, apparently the investigation cost $150,000. So these were resources that were put into trying to find her, investigate the crime, but also investigating it over a series of time. And when people do lie about their crimes, this then takes away from real crime. Things like human trafficking, things like people who have actually been kidnapped. The other thing it does is it creates a real harm to the idea of whether someone has been kidnapped or not. It creates things like copycats. People think, oh gosh, I want to break for my children, I'll just go and pretend I've been kidnapped. But it does also create that sense of next time someone goes missing in this kind of situation, someone that might be a bit manipulative, there's the idea that have they really been kidnapped, or has this person faked their kidnapping? So it creates a real mistrust in future missing persons investigations, not just by community, but also by police. Because you'd feel scammed by her. The police in this case were very, very clever, and I was really impressed by the work that they had done. I mean, obviously I don't see everything, I only see what's sort of online. You know, I think in many cases this just would have been swept under the carpet and believed, but, you know, they really looked into it and they were very thorough and discovered the truth, which was, you know, so important in this case. So I've talked about her behaviour and how she's impacted other people. So now let's look at the dark tetrad traits that she has potentially displayed, and she does really fit in with a lot of these categories. In terms of narcissism, there was a real craving for attention from her. There was a level of manipulation, and she really tried to garner a lot of sympathy from the public, her husband, and other people around her, and certainly from the police as well. One of the things that we see with narcissism is a real sense of entitlement, and that was something that certainly came through in her behaviour. And she did this by applying for benefits such as victims' compensation and also applying for things like disability benefits, claiming she had been harmed. She really maintained a sense of that victim position even through her shifting lies. And I believe she said in the documentary, oh, everybody lies. And it's interesting, a lot of people use that as an excuse when they've tried to get away with bad behaviour. Everybody lies. Yeah, some people might lie about taking a chocolate biscuit out of the cookie jar, but what you did hurt a lot of people, hurt your husband and your children. It hurt your children who you love. And there's this real element of disassociation that seems to come with the female psychopaths and females who fit into that dark tetrad area. It's like they have a good excuse for their behaviour, so therefore it's okay and we should all accept it. So let's talk about Machiavellianism, and often it's associated with that strategic level planning and strategic level success. And I think in this case, she does to some degree fit into this category because what she did was very calculated and it was planned. There's levels of fraud involved and levels of public trust that she both garnered and broke. So I think there is a level of that maliciousness that came from her wanting to succeed out of her lies. Let's now talk about psychopathy and how she fits with that. So again, psychopathy is about being callous, unemotional, have a complete inability to take responsibility for their behaviour. And people with psychopathic traits often have no remorse as well. She certainly fits into this category. She really had no remorse about what she'd done. She has been persistently dishonest throughout the case. She also caused cultural harm by claiming it was Hispanic women that had kidnapped her. She misused the systems that were actually for real crime victims, and she faked her trauma to others. And she was very deceptive and manipulative and used her charm and her tininess to almost be that perpetual victim. But the fact that she was willing to do this behaviour, commit fraud and not take any responsibility for her role in this, I think is very psychopathic in nature. Let's now talk about sadism. Now, although this wasn't about her inflicting pain directly on others, she wasn't getting a kick out of hurting others, I do wonder whether there is a part of that in hurting her husband. Maybe she'd been mad at him for some reason. It certainly came across in that documentary that she was very upset about the prenuptial agreement and that she's now struggling to get time with her children. And again, that comes back to that psychopathy side of things where she's not actually taking responsibility for her role in all this. Because even if you believe the narrative that she was actually kidnapped, she did lie for many, many years about what happened to her, which made things worse. There's no real evidence of why she would protect James, why she would not tell people that he kidnapped her. That didn't make a lot of sense, and that came out so long after she was prosecuted that it made no sense. She also talked initially very highly of her husband. Her husband was this amazing man. And then now that they're not together and she's not getting time with her children, she's completely changed her tune. I think she does have a level of sadistic traits. I mean, she had herself branded by her ex-boyfriend. I don't think that was really necessary. It's just interesting, very interesting, and I don't think we'll ever know the real truth behind this. So in terms of this case, it's a really interesting one and one that leaves you questioning what you believed at any point during this case. And like I said, I've watched a lot of different interviews around this case, body cam footage, the police interviews, and initially I did believe she was quite manipulative, and then when I watched the recent documentary I almost felt sorry for her, and I was really questioning whether she was being honest about what really happened and that the lies she had told, that she had reason for that. I've since watched further psychologists do behavioural analysis of her behaviour and her body language, and after that, I am of the belief, yes, this is all lies and this was something she actually orchestrated. This is not a one-off behaviour. She's been known to be manipulative and deceptive for some time since she was quite young. And it really shows a potent mix of narcissism, Machiavellianism, strategicness, and psychopathic manipulation and lack of ability to take responsibility for what she had done. You know, the emotional damage she's done to so many people just from not being honest from the beginning and the cost to the community as a result. Sherri Papini is certainly an example of the dark tetrad traits in women, and how they can be displayed. And it's interesting how it took the police 4 years to actually charge her with fake kidnapping. Women are good at playing the victim, and we live with this narrative that women should always be believed. And this is just another case that tells us we shouldn't believe all women. We shouldn't believe all men either. We should look for the evidence. And if the evidence isn't there, then we need to look deeper. We shouldn't just blindly believe somebody. And I think the police in this case in California did an amazing job, because she was very believable, but they did not let it go. And I think it's great that they managed to find the truth out in the end and did an amazing job. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm recovering from a cold, so I'm sorry if I'm a little bit choked up, and I look forward to you joining me next time.